everyone, my name is Ali Erstad, and today I will be sharing with you my senior project research study on attention deficit hyperdisorder, college students, and remote learning, with a focus on the intersectionality and impacts that these three key characteristics have in today's higher education climate. So I'm providing you all with an abstract to kind of summarize this presentation / this research. I'm not going to go into very many details because I will be touching on all of these points in my slides, but here is my hypothesis and the results. So to start off this project, I had to do a pretty intensive literature review. And with that, I found a couple of trends and things worth noting. One is that college students with ADHD tendencies are more vulnerable to academic challenges. And then in addition to that, there is a group of college students with ADHD tendencies that fit into this subclinical ADHD category. And what subclinical ADHD means is these are people that do not hit all of the criteria for the DSM-5 diagnoses of ADHD, but they do hit some of the criteria and they still have symptoms that do impact their lives. So it's subclinical, but without the formal ADHD diagnoses, as they did not hit all of the DSM criteria. And this is a really important group for this study because there are a lot of people that experience the tendencies and the effects of ADHD without the diagnosis. And then in addition to this, I investigated online learning and ADHD. And with that, I found some negative effects of online learning on both students with and without ADHD. In addition to that, the skills needed to succeed online are often skills that students with ADHD struggle with and have a more difficult time with. So that makes it harder for them to succeed online. In addition to that, disabled students have a really hard time with remote learning, which ADHD is a learning disability. So they already have like a history of not succeeding as well on remote learning, and engaging students online is very difficult. And with students with ADHD who are already more vulnerable to other struggles with engagement online, this can be pretty challenging. So my hypothesis for this study was that college students over the age of 18 who self-report higher ADHD tendencies will have negative perspectives and experiences with remote learning. So to measure this, we recruited college students 18 years and older through the SONA system. Each subject received 1 hour of research credit for their participation in this study. And we were able to recruit 65 subjects with a mean age of 23.31 years old. And 57 identified as female, 7 identified as male, and 1 identified as non-binary / third gender. And all genders, racial, and ethnic groups were recruited and included in the study, and no identifying information was obtained from participants. So for the study, we used 2 questionnaires and a ADHD scale. So the first questionnaire was just a basic demographic questionnaire. And the second was an engagement questionnaire that Dr. K and I worked on composing, and it consisted of 18 questions regarding students' perceptions and outcomes regarding online learning over this past year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in our questionnaire, participants were asked to rate their level of agreement with certain statements. And then in addition to that, we had an ADHD self-report scale. We used the ASRS version 1.1, so we used the adult ADHD self-report scale. And the ASRS version 1.1 is a checklist of symptoms that serves as an instrument consisting of 18 DSM-4 criteria for ADHD. So the higher scores on this scale are correlated with higher number of symptoms and severity of symptoms. So that's important to remember while we look at the research and the discussion. So the results of the study kind of there were a ton of correlations and data that we collected. So in order to kind of analyze all of the data, we used SPSS version 27, and we did a series of preliminary analyses to examine the nature of online learning engagement and ADHD tendencies. And these include descriptive statistics and Pearson correlations with two-tailed significance tests. So the descriptive statistics for the ASRS version 1.1, so that's the ADHD adult scale, self-report scale, are below. And it's important to note that the minimum that a person can receive on this scale is an 18 and the maximum is a 90. So within our data, our minimum did not hit that 18 threshold, it hit 35. And our maximum statistic did hit that 90. So that's the highest score that someone can receive on the ASRS version 1.1. So below are the is a table with all the correlations between the ASRS version 1.1 and the engagement questionnaire. If you have any more questions about this, you can let me know in the comments, because I know it can be a little bit difficult to read, but I'll go through all of the correlations in my next few slides. So the correlations between the ASRS version 1.1 scores and the engagement questions are below, and I'll kind of walk through these real quick. So students felt that they did not learn as much online as they would expect to learn in person. Students that scored higher for ADHD tendencies, so all of these are for students who scored higher for ADHD tendencies, preferred in-person learning to virtual learning. They did not feel that they controlled their own environment. They had more difficult time starting and finishing work online as compared to if it were in person. They thought it was more difficult to start tasks online compared to in person. They had more difficulty managing deadlines with online learning, and they felt less organized with their materials with online learning. So in addition to that, we found some exploratory data and ran some, well, because we were running so many Pearson correlations, these are a couple that stood out that weren't necessarily related to the ASRS version 1.1, but were still worth noting. And these include that students do not feel that they learned as much as they would, our students felt that they learned as much as they would have in person online when their classes were offered synchronously. While when their classes were primarily asynchronous, they felt that they learned less online than they would have in person. And then in addition to that, the students that reported higher GPAs also perceived that they had a higher support from their professors and their institutions. So what does this all mean? So the bottom line for the main question that we're kind of posing in this study is that students who scored higher for ADHD tendencies had an increased risk for online disengagement. And going through some of those results that I had just touched on, we know this because they're learning less online. They preferred in-person learning to virtual. They had a lack of environmental control, more difficulty starting and finishing assignments, more difficulty managing deadlines, and felt less organized online than in person. And this is really important for us to take into consideration as the future of higher education is changing due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the switch to virtual learning. And there are so many students in the world and the United States impacted by ADHD and who suffer from ADHD tendencies. And while we're shifting to this more global and accessible online education form, we need to consider the needs of these students. So in addition to that, going back to the exploratory data, as I kind of shared in the results that students believe synchronous online learning was comparable to in-person learning, but asynchronous learning was not. And students who perceived higher levels of support from both their professors and institutions self-reported higher grades. So this first bullet point is really important because, as I was talking about in the previous slide, as we switch to a higher education system that functions online to a degree, students are not feeling that they're learning as much when these courses are taught asynchronous. So there needs to be a focus on synchronous online learning so that it's comparable to in-person learning, and the value of higher education still stays at where it would be if it were offered in person. And then in addition to that, being online support can look very different than it does in person. So professors and institutions that provide their online students with abundance of support and really make that effort do have an impact on students as they are reporting higher grades. So the implication of this research is pretty important. And one of the first things it does is it increases faculty awareness about this issue and highlights the issues of subclinical ADHD and online learning. So some things that could be done with this research is highlighting specialized support. So this is not an extensive list, and it's actually a list that I had come up with based off of some of the research that I think could support these students better. But these include having a clear course schedule at the beginning of a semester or quarter that outlines deadlines, dates, has all of the assignments on there. It could be really helpful for students with ADHD tendencies to feel that they have better management skills over their own schedule and have they can time themselves better for when they need to start and finish assignments. In addition to that, having organized course materials is really important for students to with ADHD tendencies to do well. So by organized course materials, I mean more on the faculty's part. And this includes a really clean and organized class page where these students can go and find the information they need. And in addition to that, it might include just very clear and concise communication so that students with ADHD can take out that extra level of fear over disorganized materials that they don't have control over. So obviously students with ADHD tendencies do need to still focus on their environments and what they can control, but this is something that professors can do to help. And then in addition to that, based off of the research regarding engagement and disengagement of students with ADHD, adding breaks, especially to synchronized lectures, are really important. And this could be done asynchronously too, through assignments that might be a little bit different. And this just kind of allows students to stay engaged in the material and online. So there were a few limitations of this study, and those are mainly about surrounding factors that were not considered, which include stress, anxiety, other learning disabilities, and the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And because of this, future research should include scales that measure these factors so that we can primarily look at the effects of online learning and ADHD symptoms without fear that some of these other factors are affecting the research. Thank you so much, and I really look forward to answering your questions in the chat. Have a great day.